The bright studio lights of Good Morning America gleamed across the polished floor as the crew rushed around, adjusting cameras, checking microphones, and whispering final instructions into headsets. It was supposed to be an easy morning, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing controversial. But the atmosphere had a strange tension, a kind of tightness that even the interns could feel. John Travolta stood just off set, hands folded, eyes scanning the vibrant studio with a calm that wasn't quite calm. He had come to promote his new film, a personal project, one he directed, produced, and starred in. It meant a lot to him, maybe too much. And he knew George Stephanopoulos had a reputation for asking tough, sometimes intrusive questions. John was ready, or at least he thought he was. 30 seconds, Mr. Travolta, a stagehand said politely. John nodded. Let's do this. The cue music faded, the cameras rolled, and George Stephanopoulos turned to the audience with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent decades on morning television. Welcome back to Good Morning America. Joining us now is a Hollywood legend, actor, director, and producer John Travolta, here to talk about his powerful new film, Shattered Roads. The audience clapped enthusiastically as John walked onto the set. He smiled, waved, and took his seat across from George. John, George began warmly, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you, George. Happy to be here, John replied. But the warmth lasted only seconds. George leaned slightly forward, a subtle shift that the producers recognized instantly. It was the posture he used before a sharp question. So, George said, your film touches heavily on themes of loss, regret, and redemption. Some viewers say it mirrors your personal life in a way that feels intentional. Is this movie your way of addressing unresolved issues? John blinked. It wasn't the first question he expected, not by a mile. Well, he said slowly, the film deals with universal human experiences. If people see personal connections, that's their interpretation. But it's not autobiographical. George nodded, but his eyes sharpened. Some people feel, he continued, that the film is actually a response to past criticisms, about your career choices, your break from major blockbusters, and even some personal controversy. Would you say that's true? The audience shifted in their seats. The studio grew noticeably quiet. John's smile thinned. George, I came here to talk about the artistry of the film, not gossip. George didn't flinch. I understand, but our viewers are curious. A lot of them feel the film reflects a struggle for relevance, a desire to prove something. Do you feel you've been misunderstood? John inhaled sharply. Something inside him tightened. He knew interviews could get tough, but he didn't expect it this early. He leaned forward. You know, George, he said, his voice lower now, I spent 2 years making this film. Not for critics, not for the press, certainly not to prove anything to anybody. I made it because I love storytelling. Isn't that enough? George hesitated, but only for a moment. Well, he said, our job is to ask questions people are already asking. John's jaw flexed. Then maybe ask something meaningful. A murmur shot through the crew. George kept his composure. All right, let's talk about meaning. In the film, your character loses a loved one after a long struggle. Some viewers connected that to your own loss. John cut him off. George, stop. The air froze. I'm here to talk about the film, John repeated firmly. Not to have my personal life dissected on national television. George's smile became thinner, more professional than genuine. John, you've always been open with your fans. They relate to you. They want to understand the man behind the performance. John stood up a little straighter in his seat. They can understand me through the work, he said. That's why artists create. For a second, it seemed the tension might cool. But George pressed one question too far. Do you think recently, he said carefully, your films haven't been performing because audiences struggle to connect with you the way they used to? The words hit John like a slap. Silence spread across the studio like spilled ink. John leaned back, stared at George, and let out a breath that wasn't calm at all. So that's what this is? He asked. You're not interviewing me about my film. You're trying to corner me. Not at all, George replied smoothly. I'm giving you space to address concerns. Concerns? John snapped. You mean your opinions, your assumptions? George opened his mouth, but John raised a hand. No, hold on, John said, his voice rising. I've been in this industry for 50 years. I've made classics, I've made flops, I've taken risks. But I've always shown up with respect. And right now, you're not giving me any." A gasp rolled through the audience. Cameras didn't cut. Producers didn't intervene. They were frozen, staring at the unfolding train wreck. George attempted to regain control. "John, we're just having a conversation." "No," John said sharply. "You're provoking one. There's a difference." He stood up. The chair scraped loudly across the polished studio floor. George blinked, caught off guard. "John, please. You want to talk about the film." John said loudly. "Then talk about the film. Otherwise, don't invite me here just to poke at things you know are painful." George raised his hands defensively. "No one is trying to hurt you." "Then stop pretending this is journalism," John snapped. "It's sensationalism. And I'm done." He removed his microphone, placed it on the table with trembling restraint, and stepped away from the desk. Audience members whispered, phones subtly rising to capture the moment. A producer hurried onto the set. "Mr. Travolta, please." But John didn't stop. He turned, looked straight at George, and said clearly, "You lost control of this interview the second you chose drama over dignity." And with that, John walked off the set, leaving the studio stunned, the producers scrambling, and George Stephanopoulos staring at an empty chair, unsure what had just happened. The segment cut abruptly to commercial. But the fallout, that was only beginning. The commercial break felt like a storm rolling through the studio, fast, chaotic, and impossible to stop. Crew members rushed in all directions, producers argued in hushed but frantic whispers, and George Stephanopoulos sat frozen, staring at the empty space where John Travolta had been moments earlier. No one moved toward George. No one dared. John Travolta hadn't simply walked off, he'd detonated a moment that would explode across every screen, every feed, every news outlet within minutes. And the world outside the studio was already reacting. Backstage. The calm after the explosion. John strode backstage with a speed that surprised everyone. His face was tight, breathing steady but heavy. A few people tried to approach him, but he waved them off politely. He wasn't angry at the crew, only at the ambush he had walked into. "Mr. Travolta," a young production assistant said, sweating nervously, "your car is ready." John nodded. "Thank you." But before he could leave, a senior producer rushed toward him, Melissa Grant, known for her ability to turn any disaster around in seconds. "John, please," she said gently, "can we talk? Just for a minute." John stopped. "Melissa, you know I respect you. But that interview crossed a line." I know it did." She lowered her voice. "But we need to address how it looked on camera." John arched an eyebrow. "How it looked?" Melissa sighed. "George is already in the control room saying it was just a miscommunication." "But John, he's making it seem like you overreacted." John pressed his lips together. "Overreacted? He attacked my career, my film, and brought up things he had no right to." "I agree," Melissa said. "But he's George Stephanopoulos. People will listen to him." John looked away, jaw tightening. "Then I'll tell my side. Meanwhile, George faces the consequences. Inside the control room, George Stephanopoulos wasn't nearly as calm as he appeared on camera. He tugged off his earpiece and rubbed his temples. "That was not my fault," he insisted. "He blew up over nothing." The executive producer gave him a look that could cut metal. "George," she said firmly, "you pushed him. Everyone saw it." "I was doing my job," he snapped. "You were poking a wound," she countered. "And on live TV." Another producer chimed in. "Social media is already blowing up. #Travolta walkout is trending." George stiffened. "But that's good, right?" he asked. "Publicity." The room went silent. Finally, someone said, "Not the kind we want." George's face dropped. Across the city, the internet erupts. Within minutes, millions had seen the clip. Some defended Travolta. George went too far. That wasn't an interview, it was an ambush. Travolta handled himself with dignity. Good for him. Others criticized him. He's a celebrity. Tough questions come with the job. Walking out looked unprofessional. But one thing everyone agreed on. The moment was unforgettable. John's publicist arrives. John was already sitting in his car when his publicist, Dana Rivers, opened the door and slid in next to him. "Okay," she said, breathless, "before we even talk about what happened, I need to know, are you okay? John exhaled. I'm fine. Just tired of being treated like a headline instead of a human being. Dana nodded. Understood. But the clip is everywhere. Every outlet is calling. He rubbed his forehead. How bad is it? She hesitated. Honestly, it's huge. But it could be turned into something positive. John looked skeptical. How? She smiled slightly. By telling the truth before someone else twists it. George makes his move. Back in the studio, George recorded a short statement for the next broadcast. Earlier today, there was a tense moment during an interview with John Travolta. I want to clarify that my intention was never to upset him. I was simply doing my job. I hope we can revisit the conversation in the future. He sounded calm, professional, and entirely unconvincing. Producers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew damage control when they heard it. John responds. John's publicist drafted a statement, but he shook his head. No PR speak, he said. I'll say it myself. He sat down, looked into the camera his team set up, and spoke plainly. I walked out because the interview became personal in a way that wasn't appropriate. I'm proud of my film. I'm proud of the work I've done. And I believe interviews should respect boundaries. No anger. No theatrics. Just honesty. The clip went viral instantly. A call that changes everything. Later that evening, John sat in his hotel room staring out at the New York skyline when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number. John. It's George. John stiffened but didn't hang up. George sighed heavily. Look, I pushed too hard today. I'm sorry. Silence. John finally replied, thank you for saying that. George continued, I wasn't trying to attack you. Sometimes I get too caught up in the journalist mindset. I crossed a line. John nodded slowly even though George couldn't see him. We're both human, he said. Let's leave it there. But George wasn't done. Would you come back on the show? He asked quietly. John almost laughed. Not today. Fair enough, George said. But maybe one day. Maybe, John answered. And then he hung up. The public reacts again. When news broke that George had apologized privately, online sentiment shifted strongly in John's favor. People admired that he stood up for himself. People admired that he accepted the apology. People admired that the confrontation didn't turn into a feud. For the first time in years, John Travolta wasn't just trending, he was respected. The ending of Part 2. As night fell over New York, John finally relaxed. His film, Shattered Roads, suddenly had more publicity than any marketing campaign could have bought. He hadn't planned for drama. He didn't want drama. But fate had delivered it anyway, and John handled it with honesty, fire, and dignity. And somewhere far across the city, George Stephanopoulos sat in his office replaying the moment again and again, realizing the interview that was supposed to be routine had become the most talked about moment of the year.